And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're really glad you could join us today. My name is Shamini Jan. I'm the founder and CEO for the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, and it's my great honor to have with us today Dr. Julie Yao. I'll be diving into a really quick introduction for Julie, but before I do, I just want to orient all of us to this wonderful platform that we use with Crowdcast. As you can see, plenty of opportunities to chat in the window here on the right-hand side of what you see, but you'll also see something at the bottom that says, ask a question. If you have a specific question for Julie, I ask that you put it in there. You simply click on ask a question. And when you do, you can type it in. And what's really cool about it is that your friends that are with you right now during this webinar can also upvote your question. So if you see a question that is pretty much exactly what you wanted to ask, just upvote it, and the ones with the most upvotes will come. This is, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative is a nonprofit, and we really believe in sharing with you all of the wisdom from many traditions with respect to consciousness and healing. So if you like what you're learning here, then we ask that you consider supporting the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. And there are a couple of ways to do that. If you click on the call to action button, you can become a contributor. It's $5 a month or $60 a year. And in return, you'll get access to Julie's webinar and all the webinars that we have every first Friday of the month. In addition to monthly meditations, conference discounts, and things like that. I know many of you are already part of the community, and we really thank you for your support, because it's your support that makes these webinars and other education activities possible. So now, without further ado, I will formally introduce Julie. I first met Julie at a Science and Non-Duality conference several years ago and was just absolutely taken by her radiant presence, the beauty of her presence and her ability to embody everything that she spoke about and taught. And Julie comes to us with over 30 years of experience. She has a PhD in depth psychology and a few master's degrees in spiritual psychology, and a very deep history of body work and energy healing. So she really comes to us with a complete understanding of the impact of trauma, not just in the cognitive systems and the emotional systems, but really how those connect to the body and to the biofield. And so we're just thrilled, Julie, that you could join us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's really my pleasure, Shamini. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really feel a deep sense of gratitude to be invited to speak about trauma. It is such a passion of mine. As you say, I've been in the field where I've been studying body, mind, and spirit, if you will, for about 30 years. But trauma specifically has really drawn me in, and for a number of reasons. I had my own trauma that I healed, and so I see the possibilities and the potential outcome of healing trauma, how it really brings us back to our being, to our depth, invigorates us, enlivens us, and connects us back to joy. I've been working with people with trauma for many, many years, probably about 25 years. And I just see the incredible transformation in people's lives and their families, communities, and culture. And then, of course, as you said, I've been studying it for many years. So I'd really like to begin with a description of trauma, because I think there's a lot of maybe either misunderstanding or not enough understanding or knowledge of what trauma actually is. I'm going to speak about two types of trauma, shock trauma or acute trauma, and developmental trauma. And I'll give a description, and of course it's not all encompassing, but I'm trying to be as succinct and direct as I can as I describe it. Trauma, of course, is in our body. Trauma is not in the traumatic event that's happening out there or within us, or what's not happening. So trauma emerges in the body as an impact within us with the traumatic event, but it lives inside of us. So for a shock trauma, a traumatic event is something that is too much. It happens too quick for our systems to be able to cope, respond in the moment. So it's really overwhelming, and it shifts us into what we call survival mode. And we remain in that survival mode if we don't discharge this incredible amount of energy that comes up, survival energy. It would be the energy that could propel us into the flight response, to flee to get to safety, or the fight response. Right? People are probably very aware of these two responses, this fight, flight, or freeze response. I'll unpack that a little bit more. And if we don't do anything with that energy stays within our body or gets pushed down or dissociated, and that can be part of all of the symptoms of trauma that can come up later on. So in this traumatic event, there's an incredible jolt to our nervous system, and that jolt stays within us and causes this intense state of what we call high arousal. And if we're unable to calm that, then maybe we become traumatized, or trauma emerges within our body. Also in a traumatic event, there's usually this huge flood of emotion that is too intense or too much at the time to be able to assimilate, to digest it. So that gets repressed down and dissociated out or disconnected in some way. Actually, in very, very early trauma, especially in the first 6 months of life or so, that energy of that intense emotion and survival energy might bind in our system, in our joints, and in our organs, and causes a tremendous amount of dysregulation that's ongoing throughout our lifespan until we get some form of resolution. So that's shock trauma in a nutshell. Developmental trauma is very different. So that's trauma that's occurring within the first 12 years of our life, say, beginning in utero. So a fetus can suffer from trauma from a womb that isn't feeling safe and warm. I think this is a really important point for people to understand and know more of, that a fetus can actually disconnect from its tiny little body as it's forming because it doesn't feel safe. And safety is incredibly important for us to stay connected to our body. So I'll unpack that a little bit more in a little while, what can happen in utero in the first 12 years of life. But a simple way of speaking about developmental trauma is that our needs are not getting met. So we all have essential needs as we're growing up. They are to be held, to be loved, to be nurtured, to be nourished, to be mirrored, and especially to be attuned to. Because if you're attuning to a child, right, we're seeing them, we're hearing them, we can sense what their needs are, and we can apply those needs because children really do have essential needs. When those needs aren't met, our system feels as if there's a threat. So when there's a threat, it's often too much for a child to stay connected to the body, so they'll disconnect or numb out from some way. And the emotions that come up in reaction to those needs not getting met can also feel far too much to bear, or intolerable, or really frightening for different reasons. So they also get repressed or pushed down or dissociated out, disconnected from. And that emotional stress of not being able to, feel and integrate and digest our emotions has a tremendous impact throughout our life. We know that emotional stress is a major cause of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, contributes to autoimmune conditions, because the body and brain systems that are there to process emotions are deeply connected and intimately connected to the systems that govern our health. So the immune system, the endocrine system, our autonomic nervous system. So if we're not having balance in all of these systems in our body that are governing health, then our health at some point is, going to cause dis-ease. That can certainly cause into disease.
And we've seen the work with Steve Cole and others in the psychoneuroimmunology field is uncovering more and more. Of course, there's been a lot of discussion of intergenerational trauma, and maybe we'll get into that as well. But Julie, you've just spoken about, at least three, I think, aspects of early developmental trauma, one of them being the things that we think about kind of an acute incident, perhaps, often involving violence, but maybe not necessarily, can also be witnessed violence, where there is a major shock and increased arousal to the system. And there has been research, as you likely know, looking at the effects down to the epigenetic level and the mRNA expression level on how those early events actually shape our physiology to respond in certain ways. And those can be linked to increased heart disease and other issues. immune
That's right.
disorders. But you also spoke about trauma that could be felt in utero, and we're going to explore that maybe a little bit more. And then also just
Mm-hmm.
general developmental, I almost want to call it neglect, a sense of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very strong word, compared to what you just said.
Yeah,
But, essentially, childhood trauma can also come from, a really strong sense of needs not being met. And because needs are not
yeah.
met, the arousal system kicks in. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Some people may think of neglect and connect it to the Romanian orphanages and, and infants who aren't tended to for days or weeks on end. But actually, neglect is we neglect our children's essential needs and they feel neglected. It doesn't have to be over a long period of time. When a child is in distress and those distress calls are not being answered, the child feels threat. So feeling safe isn't the absence of an external threat. Feeling safe is being held and seen and nourished in an environment of safety when we're a child.
So then,
One of the
oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
So then
please.
one of the natural questions would be who doesn't experience trauma then? Is
Yeah.
and what level of trauma is, in your view, if trauma is a continuum? I don't know if you would view
Mm-hmm.
trauma as a continuum. At what point are we talking about issues that really kind of lodge into our biofield that disrupt the life force?
Right, right. Well, I think the earlier trauma happens, the deeper it is. And if it doesn't get resolved in those early years and is lasting into adulthood, it gets a little trickier, if you will, to begin to resolve it. Because if you think about our psychological self that has been built on a physiology that's already dysregulated before that sense of self is really emerging, it creates a lot of difficulties. So if we are disconnecting from our body because it doesn't feel like a safe place to inhabit from a very early age, we think this is a normal way to live because we don't know anything different. And if we cut off from our emotions because they feel too scary, we grow up cutting off from our emotions. So that, it causes all kinds of chaos and disconnection. And I would say trauma at its core is about disconnection. We disconnect from the essence of our being or our core self or our essential nature, whatever name a person would like to use from that. We disconnect from our body and from our emotions. So healing trauma and the transformation of trauma is about this reconnection back to our being, back to our authentic self, back to our authentic expression, which in one of the spiritual aspects of healing trauma, I would say, is it connects us back to ourself. And as we connect back to ourself, then we can connect to others. If we don't have an intimate relationship with our own being, how can we be really close and intimate with another without some kind of fear coming up? And when we can connect to others, it's much easier to connect to the world around us and if you like, the cosmos and beyond, or beyond into the cosmos. So coming back to our life force and life energy, when we cut off these emotions, which is part of our life force, and part of our biofield, I'll probably use the term life force quite a lot, but I'm talking about our biofield. When we get a huge surge of emotions that we're unable to tolerate and they get pushed down or they get dissociated out, that's part of our life force. That's part of the essence and our energy of who we are that's being pushed away from us. And what is it that we're using to hold those emotions and that energy at bay? We're also using.
Sorry.
Turn that up.
Yeah.
That's okay. We're also using our life force. So it's really an exhausting process. We're absorbing so much of our life force energy in our life, our biofield, to keep emotions at bay, to keep us disconnected from the body, right? And so the beauty of the transformation, I feel, of trauma is to be able to harness some of that energy, the energy that we've disconnected from, the energy that we're using to hold these emotions at bay, and to be able to reweave it, if you will, back into our systems. And this is where the aliveness and the inherent joy can return to a more of our natural state of being. And of course, there's a little work to be done to allow that to happen. We have a lot of fear about feeling the depth of some emotions that may be around us. So a lot of work with healing trauma is about facing that fear, and especially if it's coming from developmental trauma, because when we're young, it's terrifying, and we really don't have much choice, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's as if that consciousness of a child that gets terrified becomes encapsulated and remains at that age. So let's say you have a really frightening time as a 5-year-old and you disconnect in some way. It's as if that consciousness remains at that age. And when we're in circumstances when we're older that may have a similar taste or resonance to what happened when we're younger, it's as if then we see the world through the lens of that 5-year-old. And the fear that we experience is not the fear of a mature adult that we are, but is of the 5-year-old. And it's really, really frightening. So part of the work is then integrating the energy of that 5-year-old back into our system for this psycho-spiritual maturity that I think all of us are longing for, so we can really know ourselves.
This is so fascinating to me because it's actually reminding me of some of the discussion that we had in our last webinar with Eileen McCusick, where we talked about energy and information that is carried in the biofield. And in Eileen's model, and she says very similar to what other healers have said, we're carrying our history with us in our field, you know, and she has a very specific model and way that, you know, she's sort of deduced patterns in the biofield based on her years of experience. But one of the things that she would say is that, you know, she would pick up on significant events, often traumatic events that were carried in the field. And so in her model, she could actually hear them. She was using tuning forks and, you know, she could get the information. You know, she called it her mail slot.
Nice.
But, you know, many healers talk about this. They talk about the information that is almost, if you will, frozen, right, at that point in time, that is essentially being carried in the field in some way and also within our bodies. So I find it very interesting that everything that you're sharing, I think, is very much echoed in many healing traditions, right? This, this insight that you have from your own practice and your clinical practice has been found in many different traditions, and different traditions have a way of working with it. Now, of course, you know, I've come from a traditional clinical psychology field where we were trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. And as you know, that's still sort of the reigning gold standard in medical practice today, because it lends itself very well to randomized controlled trials and things like that. And yet I believe that what we're talking about is a layer deeper than simply looking at thought patterns. So I'm wondering if you'd like to speak about that a bit.
Yeah, maybe I could give a little bit of an example of the difference of working with trauma from both a body-oriented perspective and, you know, utilizing the, psychodynamics. We need both. So let's say somebody, when they were younger, really had a difficult time being able to express their needs because, you know, mommy and daddy were too busy, or whoever the caregivers, the primary caregivers are. The caregivers are too busy to be able to really attend to that child's needs. Now, a child doesn't see, oh, mommy and daddy are too busy. It's really not about me. I'll let them get on and I'll go ahead and do my thing. No, a child, if they're not getting attended to, if their needs are not being met, the only choice they have is to think it's their fault. It is my fault that my distress cry is not being heard. It is my fault my needs are not being addressed, so I better not have needs. It is my fault that when I express who I truly am, that I feel shame, right? As opposed to, let's say, for example, you're about to pull this lamp down off the table when you're 2 years old, and mommy comes running over and says, stop, you know, because she needs to save you. And she picks you up, but she's got this anger in her eyes or this stress. And the child is looking at her mommy or, you know, the caregiver for a sign that she's okay. And if the caregiver doesn't know, you know, to put them somewhere else and then say, that's okay, I just want to keep you safe, and then shine love into her eyes or his eyes, the child thinks they've done something terribly wrong.
Yes.
Maybe the parent then just goes off and goes about the business. So it's not that the parent has done something wrong. They just neglected to let the child know, you're okay, I was just trying to keep you safe. So that little bit of shame that would allow them to know that they were, you know, oh, that's not okay to do, becomes embedded in a system as toxic shame. And this is where we get a lot of lack of self-worth or low self-esteem. But so there's many incidents, but let's go with this about not being able to express myself, because if I express myself, mommy or daddy get upset. If I express myself, somebody gets annoyed at me, so I better not do that. So we learn to shut down that authentic expression of who we are. Yeah. Or maybe it's anger. Maybe, something happens and this natural aggressive impulse comes up, but you get a negative reaction from your caregiver. So that's why you learn, it's not okay to have this healthy expression. So you shut it down. Mm. So later on in life, you learn it's really not okay to express myself. Mm-hmm. And so you may go to a therapist and say, well, I never express myself when I'm in a group. I never express myself really when I'm out with my friends. And maybe in cognitive behavioral therapy, they'll say, well, for the next 4 weeks, I want you to start standing up and saying something. And, mm-hmm. I'm not really, but that's really not addressing the underlying issue. We really want to see what's getting in the way of somebody being able to express themselves, not forcing them to just go ahead and do it. So we look at, there's usually some form of fear. And if we keep unpacking it, well, if I express myself, it's kind of scary because people might not like what I have to say. And if people don't like what I have to say, they're not going to like me. And if they don't like me, I'm going to be alone and isolated. And if I'm isolated and alone, and it just goes down into the depth of these belief systems that are formed when we're young, right?
Which are lodged in the body and in the field. I mean, I think that's exactly, key because in cognitive behavioral therapy, we can use downward arrow techniques and get to core beliefs, but it still very much remains in the mental. And yet, I think for those of us who have experience with working with trauma, the experience is very visceral once trauma is released, and so I'm wondering, we do have some questions, and I just wanted to let everyone know we will definitely get to your questions. Thank you for them. They're wonderful questions. We're gonna speak with Julie probably for at least another 20 minutes or so, and we will answer questions afterwards. And Julie, there are several questions already about, well, okay, so what do we do with this? And there are questions about what do we do with it in the moment? For those of us who, are recognizing that we're being triggered or patterns are being kind of brought up, right? As, in today's times, it's very easy for that to happen.
Right.
So, maybe love to hear more, from you about, we've talked about the developmental aspects of trauma, and not sure if you wanted to speak about any, kind of the reenacting of trauma, if we have these early sort of wounds and how those are brought up, and then how do we work with those? How do you work with them when you're working with clients?
It's a difficult question to answer because everybody's presentation of what's happened in their lives is a little bit different, because there's usually a combination of some form of shock trauma and developmental trauma. And so there's really this beautiful process in a person that they will show in some way what's occurring, either through the language that they're presenting or the movement of the body, the different gestures, or it's showing up in, on their actual physical body and symptoms that we can see in the nervous system. Mm-hmm. You can see where energy might be blocked in the body, where there might be some form of collapse or rigidity or tension. So I can't really say, do this or do that until you really know what's happening for a person. Yeah. But one of the major things is to be able to look at what are the underlying reasons why I can't connect to the body, or I can't connect to my emotions. What's happening there? Really want to cultivate more body awareness. We want to cultivate more presence to be able to do that. But depending on when the trauma took place, we have to understand, if you're not in your body, you're not in your body for a reason. So it's not just about, okay, let's find a way to get you back in your body. You need to resolve the fear and the trauma that's living in the body first, and then a person will gently reconnect. So there's many different ways to do that. I have a book coming out, as I told you, next August. It's going to be published in August by New Harbinger, and that's going to have such a rich array of practices and exercises for people to do. so much information. But the idea of it, it's not a step-by-step book. It's to be able to look through it and to see where you are and to see what resonates and to see what's needed, so you can go back and forth and weave into these practices what you may feel you need or is helpful at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
It's absolutely not. No. And we're weaving in and uncoupling things that have been stuck together to begin to feel safe. So we always begin, or I would suggest always beginning with a foundation of safety. How can we cultivate safety, even in the field around us, or small islands of safety within the body, right? And then begin to cultivate connection somewhere, either externally or internally. I think those are the two fundamental pieces that we begin with: safety and connection, and then we build upon that depending what a person's needs are. But one thing I would say is that we want to be able to give to ourselves, and this is especially around developmental trauma, to be able to give to ourselves what wasn't given to us then, right? So if we weren't seen, or we felt like we weren't seen or heard or acknowledged, or we were disapproved of as a child, in some way we continue that trauma around within ourselves. So as we develop more self-reflective capacities, right, we begin to see, I'm continually criticizing myself. I'm continually telling myself or feeling that I'm not worthy, right? So we begin to see that and can be able to address that. And rather than continuing on what we felt was done to us as a child, or actually was done to us as a child, we can begin to see ourselves, we can begin to hear ourselves, we can begin to hold ourselves, we can be able to learn how to express what our needs are, which isn't as easy as people think. Like I say to many people,
self-love is not an easy thing, is it? Yeah. And yet, as you mentioned, it's the key. If you don't have that piece of self-love, then it's really difficult to extend that to others in a completely,
it's
open way.
Very difficult. Yeah. When we shut down our needs or foreclose our needs, it's very tricky to know what they are. And I'll say to people, what is it you need? Oh, I need to do this or that. But it really has nothing to do with what their needs are, And sometimes it's as simple as, I need to be heard. I need to be seen. And if we can't get that from another person, we learn how to begin to give that to ourselves. And that begins to shift our field. And that begins to move and transform some of this energy, this life force and biofield that gets stuck as tension within our system.
Interesting, so on that note, let's say we're engaging in this trajectory of liberating ourselves from our own trauma, right? And as you said, part of that is the path to self-acknowledgement, self-love. How important do you feel spiritual practices, energetic practices, sort of self-care type of practices, how important do you feel like those are for people? Is this something that, I can go to someone like you and you're going to kind of clear me of everything and I'm going to be, kind of moved along a path? Or is there some sort of, self-inquiry process that you think is useful for me, or someone like me to go through?
Yeah, I think we're all unique, and I think there's multiple practices and disciplines that people can utilize for their own healing, and it's going to be different ones for different people. I think there's usually a variation of practices and techniques and exercises that people can do, and it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. For instance, a lot of people have turn to meditation, right? And depending when your trauma was, especially if you had very early trauma and are disconnected from the body and are using a meditation practice, you might be continuing or perpetuating the dissociation because you're just hanging out in these more spiritual or energetic realms. And you're doing what could be called a spiritual bypass, not on purpose. A lot of people have no idea, but there's an underlying avoidance of the pain that's in the body. And it feels so much better to not be in the body. Now, not being in the body doesn't mean that you don't feel the body, because you can feel the body a lot, but still be disconnected from it in an embodied perspective. If you have very, very early trauma and you in the body, I get a lot of calls from people who are on meditation retreats, right? So they're doing meditation for the first time And as if the body relaxes, right, a little bit. When we relax, some space opens up. When that space opens up, up comes the trauma or the trauma memories or the feeling or the traumatic energy. And it can be very, very re-traumatizing for somebody when those disconnected or dissociated emotions or anger or the shock energy begins to come up. And they push it back down or they get plunged into terror. So, you know, you really want to be aware and be careful of the practices that you are going into, depending upon maybe the time in your life when you were traumatized and how much resilience you have in your system, how much connection you have to your body.
This is really tying into a discussion, I think, around potentially around what has often been called spiritual emergency, right? And so I think this is actually very germane to talk about because there are many people who are drawn to these very intense practices these days, whether they're, you know, long meditation retreats, 40-day retreats, you know, which, you know, maybe they do or don't have, you know, a very strong meditation practice before they do the long silent retreats or, you know, entheogenic types of experiences, which can be very intense. And we often hear about these spiritual emergency cases, right? Where, you know, all of a sudden a person is plunged into terror, you know, or other difficult to manage states of consciousness. Would you say that those are very much related to traumatic experiences that are yet unintegrated or unresolved?
I would say so. You know, generally speaking, there's always exceptions. When I'm working with somebody who's having some form of spiritual emergence, what's happening is this spiritual energy, that life force or biofield is emerging within their system far too quickly, right? That they can't assimilate it, and it is moving these tensions or encapsulated tensions of trauma that got released in their system, and it's terrifying. And they touch into these places where it feels like annihilation is going to happen, or they meet these energies that feel absolutely terrifying. And if you are not really deeply connected and rooted in your body when these energies come up, it can be really frightening. Let me show you a couple of images as I can. This artist from one of my patients that I've been working with for a couple of years. She's allowed me to show her art. It really touched me when she said this, because she said, it really helps to know that my suffering is being witnessed. And I think that's a huge statement for us all to consider, that we endure so much pain and suffering that just in the very nature of it being witnessed by somebody that can hold it or see it helps. Again, it's that experience of not being seen. So so I'm very, very grateful for her to allowing us to show me some of this. So if we speak a little bit about unresolved anger. And when there's trauma, there's usually some form of unresolved anger or rage, which can feel really frightening. For instance, rage at a biological level feels like an impulse to kill. Now, how scary is that to feel in your system, especially as a child, where you have no idea you have impulse control? And then it's just as terrifying as you're an adult. So let me pull up a picture for just a second.
While you're doing that, I just wanted to speak to, the importance of what you just said, of bearing witness. Certainly for any of us who have sat with clients, friends, family members who are really going through, the recognition of their own trauma. And of course, we see this in society today. There is a huge movement right now among so many people to be witness, to share their stories of trauma. And, for some, it's overwhelming, and some feel pressured to share. Some, are overwhelmed, they're flooded. There's a lot of that going on right now. And yet for those who are able to say, I just want to let you know this happened to me. They're at this point in their trajectory where they want that to be known, and with the desire that it may help someone else and say, I got through this. And so I see a lot of that sharing going on today. I mean, and you've probably seen it as well, without getting political, all the things that are going on right now in the US are bringing about a lot of sharing mostly among females, of course, around sexual trauma and sexual violence. And so there is a lot of that sharing going on. And of course, the Me Too movement is still very much alive today.
Yeah, and I think there's an incredible importance in sharing to be heard. But I'd also encourage anybody who's sharing to make sure that they're working with somebody that trauma has been healed, because by the very nature sometimes of sharing can trigger us too much. So there needs to be a balance, I think. Always to share and to be heard, very important, but to make sure you've been taking care of your own needs as you go along in doing this. So let me show you an image. It's actually a really disturbing image, but it certainly gets to the point of what people face when they touch into the anger and the rage inside of them that may have been there for a long time. So let me pull this up. Are you seeing it? There we go.
Yes.
Can you see it?
Wow.
So this is an expression of internal anger, right? How do we touch into that without re-traumatizing ourselves, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. How are we able to hold that unless we're actually deeply connected into the body? Now, this image here is a depiction of our life force, right? This is part of our biofield distorted into anger and rage. Right? Mm-hmm. But this energy here is potentially incredibly transformative, right? This energy here, when we transform it and bring it back and reweave it through our body, becomes our internal power. It returns maybe to the pure form of our life force. I'm going to take that off the screen because it's quite an intense image.
This is part of the alchemical work that takes place within us.
This exactly part of the alchemy that happens when we begin to touch in to anger, into rage. But what often happens that prevents us, I'm going to pull up another picture here, that prevents us from being able to touch into some of these, where is it? Oh, 1 second. What prevents us, we have these incredible, what I call defense systems that prevent us from touching in to our core wounding or our core self, right? Or some of those core emotions. And it can quite often show up looking something like this. You see this one? So wow. Somebody is right, moving into touching into these really, really scary places, and up comes this image of a dragon, or sometimes it's a devil or a demon, but it's something that's frightening. And what's important to understand is this is not some external thing that's trying to frighten you. Again, this is part of your internal defense system that is trying to protect sometimes some of the most innocent part of you from accessing it, because nothing feels safe. But again, when we access this energy in this alchemical transformative process of working with trauma and the life force, this then turns into something that is very life affirming and energizing in an internal sense of power. Let me show you two more very quickly that are a nice example of that. So here's another image of anger, just how threatening it feels, like it's ready to pounce at any moment. Once that started to be transformed and emerge, let's have a look. It's you see this image?
See, yeah, it's coming up.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we
wow.
Go.
So this is the transform. This is the initial. I'll just say the dark guardian, right? Initially.
Yeah.
And then this is the
I
process.
See much more aliveness and color in that, and much more coming alive, much more aliveness, and then this becomes an ally, right? This impulsive aggression is often aggression and anger comes in the form of a growl or a snarl in the animal kingdom, which is setting a boundary. Just saying no, or no, back off, you know. But we need to feel that within us to feel safe, right, and to feel powerful, to not get disconnected or to not. And so these aggressive impulses really get shut down within us. And really just, I don't know why this is coming to mind, maybe because everything that's on the news these days, it somehow seems that people who have a predatory nature can sense people who are dissociated to some degree, who have lost that aggressive impulse, or who have ruptures in their energetic boundaries. And
it's a dynamic, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a dynamic. It's an energetic dynamic and two patterns coming together. But when we can reconnect with that impulse within us and reestablish an energetic boundary, because we all have energetic boundaries, we all sense them in some way, maybe it's less likely that we become that a predator, somebody with a predatory nature can approach us.
That is such a wise statement, Julie. I think that, and then that's such a key take home, I think, for many who are saying, I'm feeling really triggered right now. And, and things that, I've normally just been sort of to brush off or deal with, that's just the way it is, because all of this stuff is coming up. It's sort of like, well, no, I'm not having it. There's a lot of that going on. One thing that I have found helpful in sharing with people is, the first way to start establishing an energetic boundary is everything we've been talking about today. Get in your body, get grounded in your body.
Yeah, but if there's trauma in your body, you can't get in your body. You're out for a reason. So that's why I'm saying we have to begin with saying, what's stopping me from getting in my body? What is it? Am I afraid of anger? So many people are terrified of anger because it's been disconnected for so long, and it feels like it's consuming. It's going to consume them, or they feel like they're going to hurt somebody. Okay, or they feel like they're going to be hurt. And it might not be, it's usually not conscious. It's usually an underlying, underneath somebody's conscious awareness. And so it stays repressed. And then, of course, that repression of that energy is exhausting and can cause all kinds of, distress and disease and discomfort later on in life. So let's look at what might be happening that I'm not connected to my body. Let's see if I can have some assistance in helping me connect in some way, right? To face the fear. Because the fear originated, if we're talking about developmental trauma, the fear originated in childhood where we really didn't have the cognitive capacity to understand what's happening. It was terrifying and that was it. And terror often means annihilation. Annihilation isn't death. Annihilation is existing in non-existence. It's a horrifying, it's horrifying to feel that you're approaching that. And often that's connected with trauma. And I think this is also key for people to just hold for a moment, that when we face threat as a child, or actually any time in life, but especially if we're holding children right now, you face a threat. And there's no way you can escape, right? And the threat might just be you're crying in distress and nobody comes. The system, this organism, prepares for death in a way because the threat is life-threatening. A threat is life-threatening. And the reason we disconnect is we're preparing, if you will, for death. And many people that I work with have this experience of where they go, if you will, when they dissociate. It's like we're in an in-between state, the betwixt and the between. It's neither living nor dying. It's like a preparatory death state. And and it feels almost annihilating. For other people, it's a very comfortable place to be, right? There's nothing going on. It's safer here than in my body. I'm not going back to my body. And again, it's not a cognitive, it's an energetic experience, So we really want to understand that we want to be really careful and compassionate and loving with ourselves and retouching back in the body because of the depth of the terror and the fear and the anger and rage that can be there. And to really, if you're working with someone or a group of people, to work with someone who's not afraid of touching into those places with you. And if you feel there's a depth of that, check in with people that you're working with, because working with somebody is really important because, again, the biofield is stronger. Not only is there a witnessing, a seeing, or a hearing, you're not alone. And usually in trauma, there's a sense of alone. Our first line of defense is to make eye contact with someone, to begin to feel safe. So having people around is really useful for us to begin to touch in to these really frightening places. And I'm going to share one more picture. And to begin to gather and assimilate parts of ourselves that get fragmented or cut off. Let me show you this one image of childhood trauma. It's coming up.
Oh, yeah.
See, you can feel that we curl up into, well, it's so frightening, but we fragment, or parts of us split off.
Yeah.
So the idea of healing trauma, right, is gathering compassionately and lovingly and caringly and very gently these parts of us that disconnect and split off, and bringing them back together. So it's not remembering and remembering everything that happened to us. It's a remembering of all of these pieces back into a coherent whole.
Yeah.
And when we find that coherence, I'll show a pleasanter picture. When we find that coherence, let me see where it is. I can't find it. Here's one. Right, all of our body systems to begin to work in coherence. Our body feels.
No, we don't see it yet.
Okay, here it is. Is it coming up?
Not yet. There it is. I think it's coming. There we go. Oh, beautiful. Look at that.
Yeah, right. Just we connect back to our self, our being, and we can play again, right? We can play is really an important part throughout our whole life. It's really difficult to play if you're in fear and exhaustion. That you can fake it and you can try, but it becomes even more exhausting. So this was.
This is, and just to remind everyone, those are pictures from a client of yours who has generously shared this to just share her own experience and express it as she's worked through her own trauma. So it's so beautiful, Julie. I mean, thank you so much. There's so much wisdom with you, and we'll, as Julie mentioned, she's going to have a book coming out next year with New Harbinger Publications, which will be a workbook, actually, on very specific guidance on working with trauma. And hopefully we'll have Julie back next year and, to talk a little bit more in depth about some of that work. Because as you can see, she's a fountain of wisdom in so many ways. Julie, we have, maybe about 12 minutes or so left. And I'm thinking that maybe we could go to some of the questions, if that's all right with you.
Yes, please.
That'd be good. Okay, great. So the first question that has come up is, Namaste. This is from Chitra. Namaste. How do we correct our old beliefs, which disturbs our mental health, with the help of Biofield therapy? So in other words, we have a lot of healers that have joined us today. And I think the key question here is, if we're working with the Biofield, if we're energy healer practitioners, Biofield practitioners, how do we help work with the belief systems and correct our mental health?
Okay, great question. And again, I wish there was one simple answer. Let me be as succinct as I can, maybe with an example. So if I go back to, I'd say let me go back to the example of not being able to express our needs. And we look at it from an adult perspective, right? And feel that desire or that need to express. And simultaneously, we can feel that fear of expressing. And again, I spoke about that. If we trace it back, it's a fear of, people won't like me, I'll be alone, I'll be really sad. You can trace all the way back to, annihilation. But, you're going to be alone and probably not feeling so connected because you don't express anyway. So here is this inner conflict. I want to express and I'm afraid to express. Sometimes by the very nature of holding these two energetic patterns, right? And so sort of as if we're holding them in our hands, we're holding them in our body somewhere, but we're feeling them. I want to express, I'm afraid to express. By the nature of being able to feel that, a resolution can begin to occur within the body as these energies are held and witnessed. There's a liberation, if you will. There's a freeing of the tensions that are holding them. It's almost like a third something arises and begins to shift those energies. And because we're aware of it from an adult perspective, more of a sense of agency, then that energy that was holding that underlying belief begins to be absorbed, if you will, into our awareness of our adult self or agency. And really hold this in a way that's really important. So often when a pattern is about to die, right, in the sense that it's like losing its grip,
Right.
It grasps on, it tries as hard as it can.
It's the last straw, literally.
And people go, oh, that's when it's so important to feel it and to be aware of it and to make sure you pull every last drop of that energy into your awareness so it can liberate, and that energy goes into your awareness and begins to move through your body. So that's one way of answering that question. I hope that touched that a little bit for you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. We have a couple of questions now also on intergenerational trauma. So a very specific question. How would you address on the idea that we may also carry in our biofield the trauma from our ancestors? Can it be inherited physiologically?
There's research out there that says yes, it can be inherited physiology through our DNA, through our genetics. So there is a lot of research. It's not so difficult now, actually, if you look it up. There's a beautiful book by Mark Wolin, It Didn't Start With You. He writes about that really beautifully. That can address that. But even if we look at the passing on of trauma in infancy from caregivers who haven't resolved their own trauma, right? Especially in infancy, we know at least scientifically the last 3 months of a trimester in utero and the first 6 to 12 months of an infant's life, our nervous system isn't fully developed. So the part of our nervous system that allows us to self-soothe, that allows us to feel intimacy and connection isn't fully developed. We develop that from whoever is the mother functioning figure. So obviously in the womb, it's a biological mother, and then whoever the mother functioning figure becomes. If your nervous system, if you are full of, the mother functioning figure is full of anxiety and depression and tension, that translates directly into the infant's nervous system. So as loving and as beautiful as the mother is, if she is suffering from her own trauma or distress, it's going directly into the infant. Okay? And that's huge. I think this should be taught, everywhere.
So it's interesting because, I'm sorry, go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say, in an infant and in utero, there is when this energy comes up, when we feel threat, you cannot run, you cannot fight. The only option is to dissociate and numb out. And it's not obvious that an infant or child has done that to many people. And so then they may continue throughout their lifespan disconnected from their body and emotions.
It's very interesting because there are, as you know, many spiritual traditions that have very specific rituals and practices for healing our ancestors. And this is, getting a little bit, more frontier, if you like, linked to the idea that the present moment is really the only real time, right? So that when we dive into a process of healing intergenerational trauma and healing our ancestors, we are therefore healing ourselves in future generations. I still remember, on a personal level, doing a retreat with Tay, Master Thich Nhat Hanh, many years ago, where we did this practice. It was actually the first people of color retreat that he had many years ago. And I remember just being so deeply touched by that practice, just sort of came out of nowhere. And I thought, wow, we don't learn about this in traditional psychotherapy. We don't learn about those kinds of practices. And yet now the research and the science is coming out to kind of share how intergenerational trauma can be inherited through epigenetic expression. And so how powerful these age-old spiritual practices really are for having, healing trauma across the continuum of time, if you want to talk about it that way.
There's a word that I often use, in the process of healing trauma, I talk about surrender. But surrender is not an action that we do. I think surrender happens over time as we begin to work with trauma in an embodied including, the somatics, and including the body. And in Sanskrit, there's a word for surrender that is apiragraha, and it means to return to the source, or it means to return to the owner. So oftentimes when we are healing trauma and surrendering is happening, I think when surrender happens, there's a certain sense of detachment. When detachment happens, there's sort of a sense of devotion or love that emerges, that fills that space that we've attached from and with love. So when we're healing trauma, we are, if you will, returning it to the owner. Trauma doesn't, start with us, in a sense. It's coming from an environment that is not supporting us in some way. And we take it on and it emerges in our bodies. So it's where, especially in developmental trauma, our caregivers, the environment failed to meet our needs in some way. And so we return, in a sense, trauma to where it came from. And some people are saying, well, I don't want to return it to my parents or to my ancestors. It's no, but ultimately, if you trace it all back, it's returning it to the source. All of this, it's returned to the original source. But in many of the spiritual traditions, there are practices that directly address our own trauma through spiritual practice in an embodied way that they say go 12 generations back and 12 generations forward.
How powerful.
Now science, I think, is saying 3. It's incredibly powerful.
Beautiful. Well, I think we have time for one more question that several people are interested in hearing more about. And that is, Julie, can you speak to how we can recognize and navigate through a freeze response in the midst of conflict? So we're in the middle of something going on right now. We notice we're freezing. What can we do?
Well, if you're aware that you're frozen in a moment, that's great, and you may want to move in some way. Maybe if you can manage to look around, move your head, neck, and eyes, right? That can really orient you to the present moment. And of course, that freeze is happening in the present, but it feels like the past is right here in this moment. Being able to look around allows your system to perceive or neurocept a little bit more safety. Any kind of movement in your physical body can do that. If there's somebody safe around that you can make eye contact with, do that. Right, our first line of defense against threat is to find eye contact with a safe other, and that can begin to soften the nervous system. If you're by yourself, do you have a picture of somebody who's loving, you gazing out of that picture? Look at them. Imagine a loving being looking directly at you, holding you. Remember the freeze response. And again, let me unpack this just quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time. We know fight, flight, freeze. It's a little bit more complicated in that. The freeze response is a response where we're sort of actually frozen in fear, but we can move our eyes. And if we see a moment where we can escape, we can actually draw upon our survival energy, our life force, and bolt or fight. But a freeze response that I think is really important to understand is the immobility response. So if we cannot flee, we cannot fight, we cannot, look at another person for safety, then we go into an immobility response. This is really important for what's happening out in the world today, is violation of our bodies and not being able to fight back or feeling like we can't. If we enter into an immobility response, it's like the body goes, the muscles go flaccid, it's a sense of collapse. We can't move. We really don't have a choice. It's a non-volitional response, meaning you don't have a choice. I work with a lot of women and men who've been sexually abused, and they said, I just couldn't move. And they feel a tremendous amount of shame and guilt about that. And it is not their fault. It is not your fault. Your system perceived so much danger that it thought the best thing to do was to begin to shut down. It was perceiving a life threat. Now, many people have that immobility response because of shutting down in childhood. And it makes no sense why, as an adult, they couldn't fight back. But if you have an immobility response and shut down in childhood or infancy or even in the womb, that's a default mechanism in your brain and body. So people who are in active duty, veterans, police officers, any anywhere who finds himself freezing in the sense that they can't move and are more sort of in a flaccid response and can't fight back, it is not your fault. It's really important to know that. I wish this would be, we put out there in court when people are in battling cases for themselves. Really important. That's the freeze response that people get stuck in, is incapacity to move.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Julie, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. You know, this is such a vital topic for today and today's times. And really, you know, it's a perennial topic. It's something that everyone goes through, and everyone has to learn how to navigate being a human being on this earth. And I know that many of you watching are healers, and you work with people on a regular basis. So I trust that you have found a lot of wisdom in what Julie is sharing today, and we'll look forward to bringing her again on soon as part of the Chi community for an upcoming webinar and potentially a live event happening in July as well. Just wanted to remind you all, we hold these on the first Friday of every month at 11 o'clock Pacific time. If you enjoyed this and you aren't a Chi contributor yet, I'll invite you to click on the call to action button and become a Chi contributor. It's only $5 a month. You'll get access to replays of this webinar and many others, online meditations that you can download as well every month, discounts to conferences and other goodies. And of course, it helps us to support this type of work, including these webinars. So we thank you very much for your support. And Julie, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill. Shamini, thank you so much for allowing me to speak in such a short time. So much information.
And so much amazing material that you've covered is really incredible.
Just like a small amount, really, of I think what we need to understand about trauma and healing trauma in the biofield. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just so people know where they might be able to contact you in the future, what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you or learn more about your work?
Probably on my website. Connect to me through my website, which is juliebrownyow.com.
There we go.
www.juliebrownyow.com. Thank you. So you'll find my email on there, which is juliebrownyow.com. You can email me. At the upcoming SAN conference in October, I'm going to be giving a talk specifically or a presentation on healing developmental trauma there, where it'll really be much more focused and directed to healing developmental trauma.
And is that this month, this October?
This October, yeah.
Okay,
and in the Bay Area, the Dorothy Hayes Mansion Science and Non-Duality. And hopefully more coming up with you soon this CHI. Yeah.
Looking forward to that. Okay. Thank you so much. Everybody have a beautiful day.